Have you ever been asked who would win in a fight between this thing and this thing? Pirate versus samurai, grizzly bear versus silverback gorilla, the Batman who laughs versus the toddler who wins. You get the idea. These matchups are typically referred to as versus battles or versus debates. They happen on playgrounds, on internet message boards, in basement bars, in the backs of cars, basically anywhere people banter. The act of comparing different characters' strengths and weaknesses to determine a winner in one of these hypothetical battles is called power scaling. Although this term applies to any kind of versus battle, the word power scaling has the strongest connotation towards versus battles about characters from pop culture, such as comic books, video games, and anime. Power scaling, and the power scaling community by extension, as you may know or have surmised already, is fairly divisive. You can find endless videos on YouTube complaining about power scaling and power scalers, that it's a ridiculous practice performed by ridiculous practitioners. But what is it about power scaling that frustrates people so much? The purpose of power scaling is to place characters onto measurable scales, so that versus battles can operate much more smoothly, so that there isn't any confusion about who would defeat who. If only it were that simple, though. The Versus Battles Wiki is a popular resource for power scalers. On the site, the standard scales of power are explained in detail, along with versus battle vernacular and tons of characters ranked and archived based on their combat capabilities. The easiest capabilities to measure are physical ones, such as attack potency, durability, and speed. But what about the characteristics that we can't see? A character's mental faculties would certainly be difficult to measure quantitatively. Of course, IQ could be used as a rough measure of how smart someone is, but power scaling demands specificity, and IQ has long been critiqued as not directly proportional to intelligence. Suppose that IQ were a perfect indicator of intelligence. How would we even be able to accurately reflect that in versus debates? How could anyone come up with a versus battle strategy with the complexity that, for example, Dr. Doom would create, a character with super genius level intelligence? Well, what about the comic writers then? How can they write Dr. Doom in a way that's accurate to his intelligence level? That's a fair point, Liam. And to answer that question, I'd like to point out that there are two key differences between versus debates and published works of fiction, such as comics. The first difference is, given that versus debates unfold in real time, often with strangers on the internet, things like reliable foreplanning and narrative editing are rather infeasible. As such, representing characters who would plan far ahead becomes either impossible or very annoying. This character has an IQ of 200, so they will always think of something to counter that character, who only has an IQ of 150. If we fully trusted IQ as a directly proportional intelligence indicator, then this wouldn't be an unreasonable thing to say. But this would make for a boring-ass discussion. It would just be a numbers game. And yet, the power scaling precedent is already that of a linear scale. The most central component of power scaling is its transitive property, the idea that if A beats B and B beats C, then A can beat C. This syllogistic understanding of the nature of battle is too simplistic. One only needs to look at Pokemon-type matchups to get an idea of how battle strategies can consist of complex webs of strengths and weaknesses, such as how water is strong against fire, and fire is strong against grass, and grass is strong against rock, and rock is strong against ice, and ice is strong against dragon, and dragon is strong against dragon, and dragon is strong against dragon, and dragon is strong against dragon, and dragon. In cases where the disparity of power is large and obvious, such as a character at a 10B level, that of an average human, fighting a character at a level of 4C, at star level, and all other things being equal, then it would just be a numbers game, regardless of what strategy the 10B character might have or any other external factors. The thing is, though, all other things are seldom equal. Most characters' power statistics are quite varied, not to mention the wide array of unique abilities that they might have, which are not measured on the standardized scales, by the way. Let's use JoJo's Bizarre Adventure's power chart as an example. Wait, that's not right. Okay, there we go. These charts tell you next to nothing about the actual strength of these characters. For example, Cream has the ability to literally erase things from existence and has a B in power, while Kraftwerk has the ability to freeze things in space and has an A in power. What does this even mean? Surely you can appreciate that the power to literally erase things from existence should be ranked stronger than the power to stop things from moving. Craftwork also allows energy to be stored and eventually released through the frozen objects, but I still don't think it should be ranked above cream, regardless of how cool a power it is. There are even times when the scales are broken, such as some of Notorious B.I.G.'s stats being infinite. To be fair, though, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is not known for its consistency, very much the opposite, in fact. But my point still stands. What I'm saying is there are entirely too many variables to assess mathematically. But power scalers are somewhat infamously known for their math, as many people take it upon themselves to make calculations to determine precisely how impressive a character's feats might be, such as Maki Zenin from Sorcery Battle catching a bullet with her bare hands. A user by the name of Dr. White, with 3 E's at the end, concluded that Maki can thus apparently move at a speed of Mach 7.42, or over 9,000 kilometers per hour. I applaud those that have the dedication required to make complex calculations on behalf of a character they like, but I worry that these efforts might be for naught. This encapsulates a glaring issue intrinsic to power scaling. Did the author intend to make a character that strong, or was it just the rule of cool on display? The rule of cool is a concept in fiction writing, popularized by Dungeons & Dragons, that states that some logistical gaps can be excused, provided that the result is cool. Maki catching a bullet with her bare hands might not be logical, but it's cool, and as a result, permissible. Speaking of fiction writing, did you know that versus debates are a kind of fan fiction? Anyway, the problem is, the rule of cool doesn't really fit into power scaling, because then what are we supposed to treat as canon, and what as an embellishment? Is it then the fault of the author for not fully considering the power implications of each feat? There are some cases where it is, or should be obvious, that artistic liberties are being taken, such as Phoenix Wright using air manipulation. But there are many where it's not, such as Jotaro and Dio suddenly flying during their battle at the end of Stardust Crusaders. I worry that a need to determine what is canon and what is an artistic liberty could risk the development of an unnecessary and even harmful habit of separating the parts of a story into real and fake, as opposed to looking at the parts together as a whole. After all, authors don't write metaphors with the intention of tricking you. They write them because they help paint a pretty picture. At least, most authors don't try to trick you with metaphors. Another more substantial example is Demon Slayer's breathing techniques. Characters are depicted wielding elemental powers, but are in actuality just performing various combat techniques that evoke those elements artistically. However, the Versus Battles Wiki explains that Tanjiro and other Demon Slayers have the ability to manipulate the perception of those witnessing their swordsmanship to produce extraordinary prestidigitation. I believe that this was a misinterpretation of the author Koyoharu Gotoge's explanation, that the elemental effects are not simply a stylistic choice to differentiate each character's unique fighting style, but that they are diegetic hallucinations. Power scaling Demon Slayer characters, accurate to how Gotoge intended them to be, would make any versus battle that they're in unfair. Gotoge retconned their powers to be lame as fuck for literally no reason, but I digress. What is a fair fight, anyway? One's first thought would likely be a fight where each opponent has a relatively equal chance of winning. I think this definition is fine, but the fairness of a fight doesn't actually say a lot about how interesting the fight is. A balanced fight can be interesting because it can be anyone's win, and an unbalanced fight can be interesting because of how the underdog might find a way to prevail despite the odds. Yet, fairness is on the mind of power scalers constantly, whether they know it or not. There's this common power scaling term known as hacks, defined by the Versus Battles Wiki as a catch-all term for abilities that can be used to ignore/bypass one or more of a target's statistics, rendering them irrelevant. This is where reasonable discussion can break down very easily. This character only wins because of hacks. They wouldn't actually win. It also suggests that matchups of characters with abilities that might counter each other in interesting ways are not as valid as other matchups. In One Piece, Luffy's invulnerability to Enel's lightning attacks due to the former's being made of rubber would be considered hacks. But just because he wasn't able to be harmed by Enel's lightning doesn't mean that the fight was a cakewalk. He still struggled a lot. Luffy's hacks didn't assure him victory, they granted him the possibility of victory at all. There are 2 other common terms I'd like to bring up, both used to explain illogical outcomes of fights within a story. Plot-induced stupidity, or PISS, and character-induced stupidity, or CIS. PISS is when the events of a story don't align with the actual capabilities of a given character, such as them losing a fight that they otherwise should have won in order to drive the plot. In other words, it's inconsistent writing. Cis, on the other hand, is when a character performs at a level below their true capabilities due to internal or external factors, including but not limited to social, emotional, legal, and/or moral factors. In a versus debate, Cis would likely be used to delegitimize a character's feats by claiming that they weren't legitimate, and Cis would likely be used to explain a character's particular defeat, or anti-feat, by claiming that they weren't fighting at their full potential. While the meanings of Pis and Cis can be very important to keep in mind, the inclusion of the word stupidity puts way too much responsibility on people to understand the actual meaning of the term without being offended by the typical meaning of the word stupidity, even though it doesn't mean dumb in this context. These catch-all terms can profoundly influence how we think about battles. It's the difference between considering a fight fair or unfair before the fight has even begun. This all reflects a deeper issue within versus debates and power scaling: competitiveness. The idea that you as a person needs to win the debate, separate from the character you're arguing for. It's understandable that we might be protective of our favorite characters, not wanting them to be undermined or perceived as lame. But versus battles don't determine anything, despite what Death Battle claims. They're hypothetical and supposed to be fun. Should we then discard power scaling if this is the state of versus debates because of it? No, we shouldn't stop power scaling. Or rather, we can't. I believe that versus debates can't function without power scaling. Try to imagine a versus debate without power scaling. What would that look like? The act of considering the fighting capabilities of a character is power scaling. If we were to ignore a character's fighting prowess in discussing the outcome of a fight, this wouldn't make it not a versus debate, it would just be a poorly done versus debate. Arguing that a character would win in a fight for any reason other than that they would win in a fight does not make sense for a versus debate. What I mean is, even if it were poetic for one character to prevail over another, unless there was a good narrative reason for that character to win, it would risk being inconsistent with how those characters are in their respective canons. And in the cases where there was a good narrative reason for a character to defeat another, not considering one or both's combat capabilities, that would be closer to a standard crossover fanfiction rather than a versus debate. But some would disagree with the idea that versus debates and power scaling are inextricably linked. In his video defending power scaling and its community, YouTuber Flaky Sea Salt claims that you can have versus debates with people who aren't power scalers. He implies that you aren't a power scaler unless you've done power scaling calculations yourself, even if you use the results of someone else's calculation in a debate. He uses the analogy that if someone guessed the answer to a complex math problem, regardless of whether their guess was correct, you wouldn't call them a mathematician. I suppose you wouldn't call them a mathematician. But this analogy falls short in that it doesn't consider that a person isn't just guessing the answer to a power scaling problem, they're making an argument with the answer to that problem as supporting evidence. Later in the video, Flaky does acknowledge that the people within the power scaling community who don't do any research themselves are the issue. But in the same breath, he denounces these people as not members of the power scaling community at all. This contradiction only serves to deflect accountability. He admits that there's still an issue affecting the community, within or without it. Many other YouTubers would agree that there are issues surrounding power scaling, and while Flaky Sea Salt is commenting from within the community as a power scaler himself, there are just as many arguments coming from those that don't identify as power scalers. One of the most common arguments made against power scaling is that authors don't write with power scaling in mind. I agree with this, but I don't think it's a good reason to stop power scaling. The argument is that the rules of a particular power system don't mesh with the rules of another power system, so power scaling is dumb. But this is a non sequitur. Power scaling is discussing how power systems might interact with each other, how characters might interact with each other. Are we not allowed to play with these characters just because the author didn't intend for it? What about fanfiction as a whole? Is that bogus too? A YouTuber by the name of Zeta the Forward Thinker is staunchly opposed to power scaling as a whole, arguing in her video Power Scaling and Literacy that we shouldn't power scale at all. She says that it's impossible to have any form of effective discussion in versus battles because all information in the debate is so up to interpretation because all art is up to interpretation. By this logic, it must then be impossible to have any form of effective discussion in a literature class or an art class or music class, right? There might not be such a thing as a correct or incorrect interpretation of art, but there certainly are interpretations that are supported and interpretations that are not. According to Zeta, all power scalar interpretations are only semi-supported, which is to say that they can never be fully supported. I agree that all power scalar debates are just arguing semi-supported interpretations. because so is every other kind of debate. That's what makes them debates. What is a fully supported interpretation anyway? Is it the one that the author intended for? Then what about the death of the author? Can art only mean what the author intended for it to mean? Perhaps fully supported means that every piece of evidence within and around the text leads to one interpretation, that there are no flaws in the argument. But how can that even be possible, since all art is up to interpretation? You will eventually make a bad faith argument, she explains, because there's no way to have a good faith argument. But how can you make a bad faith argument if there are no good faith arguments? Must they not both be possible? I don't think that there can be bad faith arguments in power scaling, because nobody stands to gain anything tangible from arguing. All of the bad faith arguments that Zeta is talking about are simply weak arguments. I do agree with Zeta's point about wanting anime, manga, and comics to be discussed critically, but near the end of her video, she says that she wants the stories that power scalers love and for power scalers themselves to be treated with more respect, because power scalers and the shows that they like are smarter than people give them credit for. But she just spent the entire video talking about why power scaling is dumb and that we shouldn't do it. Her call to action is for people to stop power scaling and instead engage with fiction in other, more sophisticated ways. But by spending a half an hour explaining why you think power scaling is stupid, your ethodic rating in the power scaling community is not likely to be very high, even if you aren't calling the power scalers themselves dumb. The message is likely not going to be properly received by the intended audience. The last common argument that I want to talk about is that there are no real-world consequences, so who cares about power scaling? I've heard this said in support of and against power scaling. I really don't like this argument. It's a way to shirk intellectual responsibility, to come off as nonchalant. Yeah, I don't actually care about talking about my favorite characters. They're not real anyway. You know there are no real-world consequences, right? There are real-world consequences. This video is evidence of that. It's the consequences of being too afraid to do something innocent that you love because you might be given an arbitrary label, or the consequences of never daring to think more critically about the art and literature that you worship blindly. We can talk about how complicated things are and that there are issues that need addressing, but what are we supposed to actually do about it, and how? For starters, we could try using metrics like the versus Battles Wiki as a heuristic, rather than an infallible artifact. But that then begs the question, why are we using heuristics in a literary discussion? I don't want shortcuts, I want scenic routes. Honestly, I don't think the versus Battles Wiki is a good resource. Or I think that by trying to standardize and simplify measures of power, you're actually encouraging misunderstandings in versus debate. I don't think, controversial take, that you should talk about characters that you don't know about. Why would I need to know this character when the wiki will just tell me how strong they are? Imagine a defense attorney who, minutes before or perhaps even during the trial, has been frantically learning case facts and testimonies, trying to get up to speed. Now, legally and ethically, doing this in the context of a versus debate is obviously not nearly as severe as in a criminal court, but it's rhetorically identical. At this point, I've critiqued many aspects of power scaling, but I've also illustrated that there's not really another way to do versus debates, at least not in the way that we currently understand them. So should we stop doing versus debates altogether, like Zeta the forward thinker believes? No, we shouldn't. Zeta also calls power scaling pseudo-intellectual. I agree, but more explicitly, I believe that it's pseudo-intellectual in the way that it's a stepping stone toward the intellectual, not something anti-intellectual pretending to be intellectual. Flaky Sea Salt was on the right track when he said this. I can't have a conversation with a person if I don't try to understand said person and their point first. Intellectual conversation requires being open-minded. So if we can't change the way we do versus debates, then we do the only other thing we can. We change the way we do versus debates, obviously. And by that, I mean we change our mindsets. We strive to mold versus debates into something less combative and more collaborative. It's by definition play fighting, after all. It's not about if you win or lose, it's how you play the game. Do you remember earlier in the video when I said that there were two differences between versus debates and published works of fiction, and then I only said one difference? Well, thanks for being patient. The second difference is that where fights in published works are written with the intent of being an interesting story, versus debates are often performed with the sole intention of deciding a winner. Yeah, isn't that the whole point of a versus debate? To decide on a winner? No, actually. The point of a versus debate is not to decide on a winner, but to determine who would win. Do you see the difference? In other words, I believe the point is not to convince others that one particular character wins, but to collaborate with others to come to an understanding of which character would win, no matter where your sympathies lie. Ridding oneself of bias is no simple feat, so instead of trying to do that in vain, we can make some relatively easier adjustments, retiring catch-all phrases like hacks, plot-induced stupidity, and character-induced stupidity. I understand that denizens of the internet are wont to abbreviate things, but it supplies too much risk to use these misleading umbrella terms, not to mention that they're also particularly adversarial. It's not easy to change a lexicon, but I think one way we could do this is by feigning ignorance at these terms, so that whoever is using them is incentivized to just explain what they mean. It's power scaling counterculture. Beyond changing the language we use, the most important change is to prioritize crafting interesting fights, rather than observing obvious outcomes in versus battles. This puts much greater emphasis on the journey rather than the destination. Instead of thinking, how can I argue in a way that makes my character, and by proxy me, win? We can focus on thoughts like, how might these characters' powers complement or contrast each other? Or, what would be a clever use of this character's abilities that could make the battle more interesting? So how do we still argue in favor of a character that we like while crafting interesting fights? I don't think you do. Not directly, at least. Stan Lee, when asked which of his comic characters would win in a fight, famously said that whoever the writer wants to win will win. But a good writer would understand that sometimes, even if they really want a certain character to win, they logically wouldn't. His words could be interpreted as, whoever the writer wants to win for the sake of the story will win, or whoever the writer wants to win due to their bias toward the character will win. Regardless of what he meant exactly, a good writer should prioritize the story itself over any given character. And if versus debates are fanfiction, then power scalers are writers. This may be a tough pill to swallow, since it demands that we recognize when our character should lose a fight. But it's at this time that I'd like to remind you that losing a fight does not mean a character isn't cool, that they lost aura. If a character does their absolute best and still loses, it could even be an aura farming moment, such as Zoro losing to Mihawk or Netero losing to Meruem. Conversely, winning a fight might not be the best thing, or even a good thing for a character. Sometimes a character is given tremendous strength at a terrible price, such as Batman sitting in the Mobius chair, Mob at his unknown percentage, or any Kamen Rider in their Berserk form. Do we really want these characters to win, at the cost of their humanity? Then again, we aren't arguing about which character we want to win, but we're also not arguing about which character would win. We're arguing about which character might win. Additionally, this dilemma really only matters when discussing redeemable characters. We probably don't care about Sukuno's mental health as a result of a fight. So to answer my own question, something that I fear I do quite seldomly, we actually might want a character to win when they're at a narrative low point, provided that it makes for a juicy story. On the Versus Battles Wiki page titled Power Scaling Rules for Marvel and DC Comics, they feature a quote by Marvel Comics executive editor Tom Brevoort, where he speaks quite oppositionally to power scaling. We need to stop thinking of these power relationships in such simple linear black and white terms. If real life worked like that, there'd be no need for sporting events of any kind. You could tell which person or team was going to win without a game from just looking at the stats. Powerscaler's desire to find the objective truth about who would win is impossible, because art is subjective. There is never going to be an objective truth. Any character could beat any other character given the right circumstances, and more importantly, given the right person debating on their behalf. Science isn't about finding the objective truth anyway. It's about getting closer to the truth. Things that scientists thought they knew get disproven all the time. But this isn't science, anyhow. It's literature and rhetoric. Do I expect everyone is going to stop getting mad about their favorite characters on the internet? No, I don't. I don't even want that necessarily. Getting mad about a character you like being misunderstood or misrepresented is well within your rights as a digital citizen. But don't just get mad, get inspired. Versus debates can be heaps of fun. After all, the characters are fighting, not you. Before I make my exit, I want to point out the irony in the title of this video. Okay, that's all. Thanks for watching.